And welcome back to Devlog. In the last part I worked on a bouncy funny mushroom, and in this part I'm working on the redesign of my current player character. So if you have seen other such devlogs, you would know that the player character was originally a 3D model that is positioned in a way to make it look 2D and then animated in a more primarily two-dimensional manner. I didn't like this. I didn't like this one bit. So I redesigned my character to make it so they are actually just 2D, but because I'm myself and like to overcomplicate everything I do, I made it so the character is still 2D, but can be animated in a three-dimensional way with a three-dimensional model. Why do I do this? I don't know. Why am I like this? This is for specific animations, and also because I'm a primarily 3D animator, so it's easier for me. But this is a complicated model, despite it looking quite silly. So I'm going to go over first how the model works, the design for the model, this being the drawn on images, and then the animations for the model and how this animation would be easily achieved with such a model. So let's first talk about the character's design. The way this works is very similar to other two-dimensional characters that are not made with a specific sprite sheet of being drawn for every single frame that the character would have. So a traditional 2D character would just be drawn individually for each frame of animation, but I am not a 2D animator, so I'm not good enough to do that. So instead I did the next best thing of having a sprite sheet for my character's body parts and using those for specific limbs which I can swap out with animations. This is a technique that I was primarily inspired by in Rayman Legends or Rayman Origins. These games, if you look at the sprite sheets for the characters, while they are animated very well, they are using body parts that are enabled, disabled, and then squashed to make the character look like they are animated in a more advanced way. Another game that uses this approach is Mad Dead Rat, or is it Dead Mad Rat? The funny game with the rat. The funny game with the rat also uses this design approach for animating its characters. I feel like both of these games have a really fantastic way of animating characters. Originally I wasn't a huge fan of two-dimensional rigs, but upon reflection, meditation, and inhalation, I decided that these were actually pretty good ways to animate a character, and I would really like to try it out. Not just because it would flesh out my portfolio a little bit more, but mostly because it was fun. In terms of the actual design of the character, I pretty much just did the three-dimensional model, rendered it out, and then drew what I interpreted the 3D model to be in a two-dimensional way. This is actually really a lot simpler than making the three-dimensional model because I can make a lot of complexities in the drawing of the character that maybe would be harder to render out in a specific rendering fashion with the model, or harder to just perform in general. For example, now that her little hat has a lot more detail to it and is posed in a very specific way, I like this a whole lot more than it looked in the two-dimensional model. Three-dimensional model, this is the two-dimensional model. The hat in the three-dimensional model looked not as good to me, but now that I can draw it, I can add a whole lot more detail to it, so I'm a big fan of how it looks. If you're curious about what the design of the character is, I explained it in the video where I go over her initial three-dimensional rig. It's basically the same character, just in a two-dimensional way. So she is a little red elf thing with a big nose, and she's a witch, and I love her. She has a frying pan on her back. I am not a character designer, so I kind of just cobbled together a bunch of stuff I like. What do you think of my funny red character? You know, maybe one of these days I'll make a game with a character with a human skin tone instead of just a red girl, a blue girl, a grey girl. Let's talk about how the character actually works in their design for the rigging. So the way this character works is they are a bunch of 2D planes. These are just rectangular surfaces with the images of their sprite sheet projected onto them. So I have the sprite sheet on the left. This is the flat two-dimensional image of each of the character's body parts, and the rig on the right. These are all the character's body parts overlaid onto their three-dimensional model and then projected to the view. So these can be rigged and move around and swapped around. So you can see on the left I have different body parts separated. For example, I have the sleeve of a shirt, the arm of a arm, and the hand of an arm, all separated, and then these can be overlaid and overlapped. So this way I can have the arm underneath the shirt and I can have the hand on top of the arm to make the hand easily switched around. But I'll talk about that when I talk about rigging. Same with the body parts. I have the top of the body, the belt of the body, and the skirt of the body separated. These are for easier animating, so I can more easily stretch one part of the skirt or one part of the body without deforming the rest of the body parts. Even though there is still some deforming of these sprites, for example with the hair, if I were to pull the rigging of the hair downwards, I can extend or shorten the actual sprite of the hair, since it is a three-dimensional mesh, although you can do this with two-dimensional rigs too. Since it is three-dimensional mesh, it can be deformed and squished and stretched around as I animate this character. If this is confusing to you, just imagine all of the little body parts on the left of the image are all cut apart and then arranged as a character. And that's pretty much how it works. It's very simple. The only complexity is in the rigging for the hands, feet, and face, and any other body part that can be swapped around. I'll have multiple versions of these, and then whichever body part is not being rendered, I will shrink down and hide behind the original body part. These are just having a scale of 0 and then hidden behind the regular body part. So I can swap around hands very easily. I just have one keyframe of the hand normal, and then one keyframe I will replace the scale of the hand with the other hand, and I will replace them in positions. So the hand we are using would go behind the new hand that we want if I wanted the character to, for example, have an animation where they swing back their hand, clenched into a fist, and then punch forward for an attacking animation. I can easily switch different hand models around. The only difficulty in this situation, because switching around actual textures and rigging for characters is a little bit complicated for how I'm working the game. The issue with this situation is that I have a lot of blending of animations. For example, when moving, we have a blend between idle to walk, to run, to jog, to sprint. These are all different animations, and if I have these animations blended and I change one of the hands that would be used or one of the body parts that would be used, as they are blending, these aren't going to be smooth as the body part changing. These are going to be having the characters blended to the new body part over time. So one hand would be shrinking as it gained into the new animation, which is not a very good design, and that's why I just have to keep track of what animations will use sprite swapping, and then I will just not blend those animations because they have to be played 100% accurate so the sprite swapping doesn't work. You may be asking yourself, why not use an alternate method of swapping the character's sprite around, like just having the object different and then swapping their material in-game so the hands can be easily swapped without any issue of incorrect scaling of characters' body parts, or just having the hands different models, different objects, so I can enable and disable these in-game. This would be a lot easier method, but hear me out. I don't want to do that the easy way. The issue with a lot of my animations, as I will go into with the animations. The issue with a lot of my animations that I want to make is that I want the animations to swap the character's body parts, maybe mid-animation in a complicated way, and personally it is easier for me to scale down a particular bone and swap the animations in a manual way in Blender, in opposed to maybe adding an animation event in Unity to swap around the character's model. This way, when I'm animating, I can more easily visualize which body part the character has in which position. Granted, I probably could just enable and disable the body parts in Blender, and since that isn't exported, I could just visualize it that way and then add the animation events. But having the bones pose the different sprite swapping is just personally easier for me. Finally, let's actually talk about the character's animations. Now, I won't go into all of the animations because there's a lot, because I animate a lot, and I have to reanimate every single current animation for my character. in this new format. I won't talk about all of them because we'd be here all day, but I will talk about some of the positives of using such a system for the character being a 2D model in opposed to the 3D model. The positive is character look funny now. Character look very funny now, and I like how she looks. The positive is, I think the character just has a nice visual appeal. You may prefer 3D models to two-dimensional animated characters, but I think, personally, I really like this character in opposed to the three-dimensional model. In terms of animation, there is a couple tricky nuances for her being two-dimensional instead of her being three-dimensional, but I will go over some of the regular animations and then I will talk about the trickier ones. So we have the walking and idle animations I will just go over. The running animations are very nice. We just have her hair wiggling about and her moving in a nice little squashy way, but also maybe a little bit stiff. This is more deliberate. There isn't a huge amount of movement in her body. This is just so when this animation is played very quickly in game, there won't be too much confusion as to her motion, but there is still some nice little feedback to her movements. I think there's a nice little bounce as she runs, but it's not too distracting. The head stays in pretty much a relatively similar place. The limbs moving around wildly, but there isn't too much bend to them. This is, again, very deliberate, and the hair wobbles about very nicely for a two-dimensional model. You can tell I just moved the bone up and down as she runs to give the impression of there being weight as she runs. The jogging animation is a more normal animation. This is just her moving kind of quickly. Very, very simple, very nice, very cool looking. Mwah. The idle animation is her wiggling about. As far as the idle animation, I talked about this in the original video, but the idle animations are going to be using a system to have the character cycle between idle fidgets, so the idle animation just has to be this sort of boring pose that will have different idle animations thrown onto it in the future. But it's nice, you can tell there is a couple frames where she does a blink animation. This is just done by scaling down her eye bone, which is what it's actually called, to get the impression that she's actually blinking. I was originally going to have this so it was a sprite swap, so that the character actually has a dedicated blinking sprite, but honestly it would look so similar to the scaled down eye bone that it really doesn't matter, and I think this having a scaling system just makes the blinking actually look a whole lot more natural. With different emotions they're going to change somewhat, but the character has beady button eyes and no other emotions, so the idea for the expressions is the character really expresses herself through body language in opposed to her actual facial expression. So there isn't going to be a huge amount of facial expression that the character will have, just a handful of different expressions whenever I feel like drawing them, I guess. But let's talk about a natural animation that is complicated. The skidding animation has the character actually turning from left to right. This is, I'm going to be honest, done in the silliest way actually possible. I kind of finished the animation, felt that the method I used was stupid, but the animation was finished and looked fine, so I didn't want to just redo it from scratch. But the way this animation works is that I just flip some of the bones of the character to make it look like she's moving in the opposite direction. The legs are just rotated around, and then the head is scaled in the opposite X direction, so it looks like she was facing the opposite direction. But if you look at her model, the frying pan is not facing the right direction, it's just rotated. The potions are not the same, and her actual torso is still facing towards the right in opposed to facing towards the left, which is what she should do. But I kind of just posed everything in a way that this isn't very noticeable. Anyway, this is the character skidding to a stop, so she skids, she follows through her momentum, she slides down, and then there is a very quick motion of her turning. What I do is I very quickly rotate the legs around but keep them in a similar place, so that in one frame they are facing the opposite direction, but still carrying through where their positioning would be, and then I squish the head in a slight bit of its current facing direction, and then in another frame just swap it to the other facing direction. Same with the hair, I keep it so it's still in the same placing, and then I kind of just hide it behind the body so you can't really tell that it's flipping. This is sort of the paper style that I'm going for. There's a whole lot of just very silly one frame rotations, but this is pretty much just the easiest way to handle sort of character turning, in opposed to just doing the Paper Mario technique of grabbing the character and rotating around 180 degrees to emulate turning, which I did debate trying, but I didn't think it would work very well. So this is the character just doing their silly little turn, but I think this actually looks pretty nice. It definitely looks silly for the model. It looks if you really slow it down, it looks a bit goofy, but I think it definitely reads it very well as a character turning animation. There's a whole lot more other animations that I have to do, some unused ones, some ones that I have to just redo completely, but for now these are all the animations that I like of the character. And some of them I'm not even showing you right now. I'm not showing any of those animations. Those are for future devlogs. And that is it for this devlog. I just really wanted to talk about this character for an extended period of time because I really like how it turned out. I'm super happy with this character. Design in general, I just like her a whole lot. Usually I'm pretty off-put when I have to draw things in two-dimensional because I'm not particularly very good at it, especially the hands, but I'm very happy with how these turned out. What do you think of my lovely little two-dimensional darling daughter baby girl that I love with all my heart? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe. Goodbye forever. This is the last devlog I'm ever making. Until next week. Then there'll be another one.